My name is Greg Remke. I work with Economic Thinking and we do educational programs for students. This is the second video on an online version of our Economic Thinking workshop, Economic Freedom and EU Immigration Reform for the NCFCA topic. The first video was an introduction, and now we're heading off with the overall presentation. First, looking at a little bit of European Union history. Important for students to understand, of course, that the EU follows World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. For the students, their judges are going to be people who likely grew up during the Cold War, and yet the Cold War ended before, any of the students were born. So understanding what led to World War I, World War II, the Great Depression in between, the Cold War that followed, these are big issues, and at least students should have some familiarity. And all these tie in with immigration in interesting ways as well. I mentioned with World War I, there were no immigration restrictions in Europe before World War I. So immigration policy is something that happened for World War I. Passports were originally a temporary wartime measure that have continued. But for the European Union, the EU was founded as a result of the Maastricht Treaty in 1993, so fairly recent, but it followed earlier treaties, the original Treaty of Paris, 1952, on trade in European coal and steel, with the goal of France and Germany and others trading rather than going to war over scarce resources like coal for steel. The Treaty of Rome, the big setup of the European Economic Community, the EEC, the idea is to set up a common market where there's no tariffs or impediments to trade or the flow of labor between the different European countries. It aimed to continue the economic growth and avoid the protectionist policies that helped lead to World Wars I and II. And then 2015, the year that changes everything. This is the Syrian war that was a culmination of the Arab Spring, and it gets sort of stuck in Syria with a civil war and world powers interceding and bombing and vast number of people, refugees fleeing, and some 1.3 million applied for refugee status or applied for asylum in the European Union. 1 million let in, and that led to a surge of sort of resentment and backlash against refugee policy, leading to Brexit and other sorts of exiting the EU as countries didn't want to have to deal with refugees pouring into them. At least that was the view. And then 2020, the pandemic also influences immigration. Any evidence that students run across before March of this year is pre-pandemic, pre-lockdown. And so you have to get a sense of how is the EU responding to the dramatic reduction in wealth, the economic turmoil, and the blockage of migration that's been part of fear of further infection from the coronavirus. And Europe got hit hard before the US, and in many cases in Europe now, the virus is mostly gone. Greece, Italy is open. Sweden never locked down and is very few infections, in Germany as well. So these things change over time, but they affect immigration policy as well. Students should be familiar with the labor mobility and migration that's been part of the European Union. Now, in later presentations, I'll reach back earlier to talk about migration through Europe in earlier times. But here we're going to talk about more recent. It should say Allied occupation of Germany. The O got left out. But after World War II, the Allies, the French, the English, and the Americans occupy 3 sectors of Germany, and the Soviet Union occupies 1 sector, the East, what became East Germany. The U.S. sectors combined, and so for years after the war, the Allies were occupying Germany. Now, during this time, there was massive migration in Europe because the Germans were expelled from other countries around Europe where they lived. Other countries didn't want to have Germans anymore after the conflagration of the wars. So you had a devastating time for impoverished people escaping out of wherever they were, trying to get back to Germany. But as Germany reformed its economic policies and expanded, they welcomed these Germans, and actually the migrating Germans into Europe, into Germany, were a key part of the German economic miracle that followed the war. So first, the migration of expelled Germans back into Germany. The German economic miracle is relevant to us because it follows the economic freedom reforms that were passed under the German government. Ludwig Erhard, the economist who proposed this, they did it against U.S. orders or the Allied orders. They did it anyway. They got rid of all their price controls. That story is fascinating. People think of the Marshall Plan as what led to the economic resurgence in Europe, but it was more the economic reforms under Erhard. And I have later in this an audio discussion or essay by Ronald Reagan that tells that story too. So next, as the Germany economic growth accelerates, and also economic growth in Italy and Greece in the early years after the war in the 50s and 60s draw migrants from other parts of Europe. Later, and they brought them from Yugoslavia, even though communist countries didn't let people out in general. Yugoslavia under Tito did. Workers left. They earned money in Germany and elsewhere. They left the country. They sent money back. One of the reasons communist Yugoslavia succeeded compared to other communist countries is they let their workers get out of the country and earn income in market economies. So that's where a lot of the migrants came from to work in the German factories as Germany expanded. Later, they came from Turkey. Turkey, a very poor country, in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and so lots of Turks went to Germany. That led to anti-immigration backlash. The Turks came, not speaking German, not used to the culture, but gradually they integrated and they were part of the German economic success and part of the success in Turkey because those people sent ideas and expertise and money back to Turkey. Turkey became the most dynamic, fastest growing of all the Islamic countries during these 60s, 70s, 80s, or 80s, 90s on to the present. After the fall of communism, you get another surge in migration. When the Soviets wouldn't leave East Germany and they tried to put a communist economy in East Germany, people responded by leaving in big numbers, leaving all of communist Eastern Europe to get away from the poverty and the terrible economic policies, and that led the communists to put up the Iron Curtain, basically a wall, barbed wire, and threatened to shoot anybody that tried to leave. So migration wasn't allowed for a long time because of the border controls that were put on to prevent people leaving. One of the big things about migration is it's called voting with your feet, foot migration or foot voting. People leave places that are badly governed and go to places that are more prosperous. And that was the process people risked their lives to get out of Eastern Europe. Then in 1989, Eastern Europe collapses, then the Soviet Union collapses, and you had a huge migration of poor people from Eastern European countries into the European Union countries. So they came to work in the German factories, came to work in England, France, and elsewhere. Romanians came in huge numbers to Italy and to Spain, invigorated the economies, but also led to pushback from, Spanish unions and Italian populists who didn't like all these immigrants. Bulgarians also came in large numbers. But that turned out to be good for Romania, good for Bulgaria and Moldova. People sent money and expertise back. And also the home building and the expansion of the Spanish economy was in large part due for years to the migration from Eastern Europe. Then the EU expanded to include Eastern Europe. So then migration from these countries wasn't called immigration anymore because the countries themselves were part of the EU. For students to understand the step-by-step expansion of the EU to include, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, then Romania, Bulgaria, and other countries. So that's a key part of the story. But it changes. The people keep moving, but it changes whether it's called, cross-migration within the EU or whether it's considered immigration into the EU. So yeah, the later expansion of the EU to include Eastern Europe. So you want to know just what the EU is now. Major events of 2019. What changed in 2019? I mentioned earlier the 2015, the refugee crisis coming from the Syrian civil war. But something else happened. 2019, the European Union was transformed really by the exit, Brexit, of the United Kingdom, which was some 20% of the entire EU economy. After Germany, the United Kingdom was the second largest part of the EU economy, a major part of the EU since the founding, and they leave, and that was in large part because the everyday people didn't like the immigration and refugee policy forced on them by the EU. Now, some of these people just didn't like immigrants. Some were populists, some were nationalists, but a lot of people were just people who didn't like EU regulations and taxes, but also didn't like the lack of control they had over their own country because of the expansion of the EU bureaucracies, and refugees was a big part of that. Immigration was a big part of that. So the European Union changes. And when did that happen? Well, January of this year. January 31st was Brexit Day. They're still negotiating the transitions and what the trade and other rules are going to be, but that's important to know in your timeline for the European Union. Also, by the way, for immigration reform, here's an article from mid-July. The United Kingdom is launching a post-Brexit points-based immigration system. The idea is they want to strengthen the border against illegal or irregular immigrants and refugees, but also they want a points-based system. So instead of the EU deciding who comes, they're going to have a system where people get points for speaking English or get points for being accountants or having engineering degrees and other sorts of measures that show they would be a benefit to the EU economy and less likely to be a burden on, I meant to say UK, less likely to be a burden of UK policies, welfare policies, and so forth. That's a system. Canada has a points-based system. That's going to be one of the reforms that's proposed for the European Union. Okay, so, you'll have time, students, to memorize all this or get an idea of it, but the purple countries are the EU. This is EU and Schengen territories, which are a broader level that includes not just EU, but also Norway, Switzerland, and Iceland that aren't in the EU, but as wealthy developed countries, there's free movement of people between them. So EU citizens can go into Switzerland, Swiss can go in the EU without showing their passports and all that, or showing their Schengen membership. I actually don't remember. The green countries, Ireland, Romania, Bulgaria, at the time of this were in Schengen, but not in EU, but not in Schengen. So students should be familiar with EU countries, the ones that are in Europe but not the EU, like Norway and Switzerland particularly. And now the United Kingdom, it's not. So what policies are going to be in place, and will anybody else exit? Does Greece want to exit because they don't have their own currency, or will Spain or France or Italy? Those are some of the questions that come up, and this is why immigration and refugee policy is so important. Just a quick note on this. This is a book, Philip Legrain, on immigrants. It's in favor of immigration, as most economists are. But he writes on the Britain's experience. It opens its borders when the EU expands in 2004. There's 8 poorer countries in Central and Eastern Europe that become part of the European Union, which means their people can migrate to England to live and to work. So when this happened, there could have been 75 million people, packing their bags and wandering off to England. And that was the fear of people at the time. But in fact, that didn't happen. Far fewer numbers came. Most people don't want to leave. They have family and friends where they are. They like it where they are. They know the local language. They don't know the language in other countries. There were still complaints of, Polish plumbers. People would call a plumber and they were Polish, didn't speak good English. There were complaints about this. But it turned out these migrants to Spain, England, and other countries were a huge part of the resurgent, booming economy that these countries had. They had the financial crisis, 2008 and 9, as the U.S. did, but since then the economies have recovered dramatically until the virus. But again, if you're fearing more immigration, here's what they had. They had essentially open borders for these countries, and far fewer people came than expected or than feared. So fear is a big part of people's concern about immigration. So migration and enterprise, economists focus on the entrepreneurship that immigrants bring. A lot of amazing immigrants have revitalized the U.S. economy. There's problems, there's concerns with culture, there's concerns with terrorism and crime, there's concerns with infectious diseases, but you want to have a strong sense of the benefits immigrants bring, the costs they can bring, and what policies, encourage one and hurt the other. For example, our current policy in the U.S. is to try and track down the millions of illegal immigrants, most of whom just want to work. Pick lettuce and do other agricultural work, do roofing, meatpacking plants, hard work that citizens don't want to do. So our police and border patrol are trying to track them down, and we want legal immigration. We want people to obey the law. But in focusing on these people, we hurt them, we damage the U.S. economy, and there's less resources left to catch terrorists or criminals or people with disease. And so you don't have unlimited resources. So one focus on this is most people are against, breaking the law, crime, things like that, and that should be the focus with regard to immigration. So history of migration in Europe is one of people migrating across Europe, out of Europe. I mean, most of America were tens of millions of Europeans who left, and same with Latin America, South America, Australia, New Zealand. Why did they leave? They had big families. Germans, others had 8, 10, 12 kids, huge numbers. They didn't have enough land. Demographics drove them out of Europe the same way demographics, the boom of population in Mexico in the 80s and 90s drove 10 million Mexicans into the US, legally and illegally. Demographics are now driving people out of North Africa, where the average age is the 20s in most of the North African countries and Middle East. Their economies are so sort of corrupt that there's not enough job creation. That's why there's strife. That's why there's outmigration. So how do you deal with these? Well, at least understand them, and that's the purpose of some economic background. Economic freedom is what these countries lack. It's why these countries are poor, say economists. Part of Europe's problem now in not growing as fast as it could are welfare state and labor regulations that make it very hard for immigrants and refugees to enter the labor force and lead to incredibly high unemployment rates for young people in France and in other European countries right now. And this is a challenge that, it isn't directly in U.S. immigration policy without some changes, but it's worth students understanding where the problems are. If the European economy had been booming at 5-6% growth, they would welcome immigration and refugees. They couldn't get enough because they'd have all these new jobs being created. So when the economy is stagnating, as it is hurting now with the lockdown, but was hurting before with the financial crisis and many of the socialist policies promoted by European governments and the EU. So why is immigration such a good thing, according to economists? Well, if you look at the shape of local workers versus the shape of immigrants, this is a chart I used for the U.S. as well. This egg shape is the shape of U.S. workers, but also European workers, workers in developed economies. In the U.S., we didn't have as many engineers and PhD scientists as we might like, as were in demand by U.S. companies, and the same in the EU. Tech companies in Germany and France and elsewhere, they want more PhDs, high-level engineers, workers. They're also looking for more factory workers, skilled workers. So at the top, there aren't as many as they'd like to have. And at the bottom, and by bottom, I don't mean any kind of moral sense, just people with fewer skills, people that didn't finish high school, people that lack local language skills, whether in the US or in the EU, there's a smaller number. most people are a bulge in the middle levels of skills, training, and income. So that's the domestic labor profile in the EU and in the US. Then there's the immigrant profile. Immigrants come in at the high skill level. Vast numbers of engineers trained in India, a lot in colleges and other places. They want to come into the EU for jobs. But also, there's lots of unskilled workers, good people, but people that, grew up in rural India or grew up without even finishing a high school education who lack language skills and for the EU countries they want to go to. Those workers are low skilled, and a lot of the immigration claims or reformers want to reduce the number of low skill and have more high skill. But the complementarity of immigration is that when you combine the domestic labor profile and the immigration profile, you find they complement themselves very well. As an example, in the most of the COVID-19 deaths in the U.S. and in Europe were in elder care facilities. The very elderly, the infirm, these people need help taking care of themselves. In the U.S., most of the people that work at these places are immigrants. In my experience, the place where my mother and my father were for years, 80% of the people were immigrants from Africa, from Southeast Asia, from Eastern Europe, lots of Eastern European immigrants, nurses, and assistants. In the case of Europe, you want more people to work in these places, and local people don't want to do that work. Mopping the floor in an elder care home or taking care of the very aged, earning fairly low wages for that. It's hard to get those people. Those facilities tend to be mismanaged unless they can get quality workers. And if they're limited on the number of workers they can get within their country, they want to reach out and bring in more migrants, guest workers, work visas, and so forth. So part of the pandemic's toll came from poorly managed nursing homes, particularly in New York and New Jersey in the US, and that's the blame of government policies that manage these things, and sending COVID victims to these nursing homes, a disaster. But with better workers, more workers, which immigrants would be a big part of, you could better address those problems. So that's just an example of many, many ways that immigrants can complement, even though they compete. There's competition in roofing work and so forth. And so immigrants can drive down wages in certain sectors, but they also expand demand for goods and services as they provide more services. So that's why economists tend to be very positive on immigration. Economists are against terrorists, they're against immigrant criminals, they're against bad people, but they argue for the economic benefits of immigrants, and that is what labor unions don't do. By and large, labor unions in the US and Europe try and block immigrants because they see them as competition to union workers. And nationalists tend to oppose immigrants as well for cultural reasons. I encourage students to study the benefits of economic freedom, and one good introduction to that is the Economic Freedom Index. This comes out annually. This is a map of Europe with countries colored by their degrees of economic freedom. This is the Heritage Foundation prepares this index working with the Wall Street Journal and partners around the world. And as you read about that, you'll get a sense of the dynamics of the European economy and what reforms could help Europe grow faster. But also you can study the countries in Africa, in Asia, and South America where people are leaving from to try and get into the EU, and you'll get a sense of why they're poor. They're poor because they lack the policies that encourage prosperity. The Fraser Institute, working with the Cato Institute and other free market groups, have also the Economic Freedom of the World Index. This is a competitive index of the Fraser Institute, and you can learn more of the similar stories there about how some countries prosper compared to others. They also have an economic freedom in the Arab World Index, and this is where not only there's poverty and chaos and conflict, but there's people leaving in large numbers to come to Europe, which leads to the concern about Islam and refugees with different cultures. If their economies were reformed, there would be less pressure for outmigration, and this is a model or economist sort of script of how things could be changed and improved in those countries. And as a background to the topic, I think it's valuable to understand the overall challenge of global poverty. People come to Europe because the countries they come from are poor. Why are those countries poor? Well, according to the economic freedom indexes, they lack the economic oxygen that we take for granted, clear property rights, able to title your property, get a permit to run a business, being able to trade, have a transparent legal system and judicial system, have sound currency. So the red line is the increase in economic freedom from the 1980s to 2015, and this includes, the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. And even though China still has a communist government, it has a mostly free market economy. And so we've had a couple more billion people in the world as the increase in population happened. But we've also had an increase in economic freedom, and we've had a decrease in the number of people who are poor. So imagine that, a couple billion more people since the 1980s, and yet there are a billion fewer people in absolute poverty. There's many more that moved into the middle class, but also many in the World Bank has a number of under $1.90 a day as abject poverty. So that number has fallen from almost 2 billion to under 760 billion. That's a tremendous success story, thanks mostly to China, Southeast Asia, India, but also some progress in Africa and Latin America. So we've had tremendous progress around the world, even though there's challenges still, Africa, North Africa, the Middle East. So understanding where this progress came from gives us insight into what policies to propose for the European Union and for countries where refugees come from to the European Union. To get an insight to this, I highly recommend the documentary Globalization at the Crossroads, and you can see it at the link. And I'm going to stop here in a minute and encourage you to go to the documentary and watch the first at least 5 or 10 minutes. It streams free online. Hernando de Soto, a Peruvian economist, tells that story. In my workshops, I play a short video from that. I'm going to skip that here. I think in the next session, I'm going to talk about these books that are relevant for cities and this migration. And the key thing De Soto talks about is a worldwide migration to cities. Some 200 million people around the world are migrating to cities. More than that. 200 million just in China are illegally migrating to the cities of China. Tens of millions in Africa, millions in Turkey, around the world. And so this migration to Europe, refugees and people, is part of the worldwide migration of people leaving impoverished rural areas to cities. So having in the back of your mind this story of a rival city, the greatest migration in the history of the world, is ongoing around the world. And it's much the same, De Soto argues, as what happened in the US in the 1800s and early 1900s. Americans migrated by the millions from small farms to cities, to New York, Chicago, Cleveland. It's the same thing that happened in Japan and Europe as people migrated to cities. So this is part of the story of the Industrial Revolution and globalization that spread these technologies around the world. And we see part of that now at bringing tremendous prosperity, but also challenges as the cities in the developing world don't work as well as New York City did, as Cleveland did, as Detroit did. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much for watching, and we'll come back with another session. Thank you. And watch Globalization at the Crossroads, and then you'll have some insight into some of these ideas of the formal and informal economies. Thank you.